most job ads say you need a 4-year degree and you need 5 years experience and even entry level. What if we put more effort into the process? The people are what make the difference. And I think especially if you're building an MSP, it's a business built on people. You're just going to sell to anybody and it feels cool when you win a deal, but like you don't have much of a differentiator. They don't really know why they're doing business with you. You don't really know why you're doing business with them. And I feel like a very similar mentality. If you don't let your culture show them why you're hiring and what you're doing, then somebody may join you that's just looking to join something. Man, it's so much easier just to adopt a new shiny widget in the tech stack and throw it in, or than it is to go, man, the thing that's holding the business back is I'm unwilling to step out of my comfort zone.
Welcome back, everybody, to this episode of MSP Insider. I am so excited today to flip the cameras around a bit with the guest that I have, Damian Stevens. Please let everyone know who you are, why you're here, and why you do what you do.
Yeah, so I might be best known for being the host of MSP Mindset, where I'm currently on a mission to interview 100 of the fastest growing and most interesting MSPs on the planet, and I'm writing a book on it. I'm also known for Scarcity, where I'm the founder and CEO, and before that, I was an MSP. So I used to know what it was like.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's actually how our paths crossed, was the MSP Insider, MSP Mindset show. So it's different to flip roles here, where I'm going to be the one asking you questions. Really, from those interviews, the conversations just sort of continued between us. And I, similar to you, I get intrigued by like being curious, but then discovering and uncovering people that just have so much to share. And specifically ones that maybe are so reserved about it, right? Like truly humble about it, which is the category I'd place you in. And so our conversations have always just led down super deep paths. And so I'm really excited to unpack some of that here for the audience today. And the way we kick it off on the show is that at the end of the previous show, I asked the guest to leave a question behind for the next guest. So it sort of chains it all together. And so that's how we're gonna kick this off. Is the last guest that I had interviewed was Jonathan Schofield from Channel Falcon, and his question, which is going to tie in great to what I want to unpack with you, actually, is, Damien, how do you measure culture?
Yeah, it's a friggin' hard question.
Yeah.
I think there's the practical, and then there's maybe the aspirational. I interviewed somebody recently that said culture is what happens when you reach for the door handle. Of course, they were talking about a physical office, like what's going through your head. Yeah. Am I looking forward to being there? Am I thinking about that in a good way or a bad way? And I thought that was obviously that's pretty hard KPI to put on a dashboard, but as far as getting at it, I thought that was interesting, right? Because it's really a measure of like, how do I feel about being here at the end of the day? And how much do I want to be here? And I think there's a lot of in between there of that. And I was just sharing with my Scarcity team some of the measurements, because I think a little bit like a lot of things in your business, you shouldn't go from 0 to 100 in like operational maturity or process. So in a similar way, it's like, well, we started measuring these things and now we feel like it's time to start measuring a few more things so that, because of course being the sometimes overthinker, I'm like, let's measure 42 different things.
Yeah. And also I think like the gap between the version of the vision that you're on in your mind versus the version of the vision that your people and your team are on, right?
Yeah.
Interesting developments kind of in recent months, and being a first-time founder myself, and like in the heat of it at the beginning, right? And so much of our minds go into not only where you are, but where you need to be, and sort of out in front of all those details. So, where have you found, or have you found, maybe this is a personal question, personal advice question, like, have you found a way to ensure that you're extracting and extrapolating down and bringing that vision, even in its current layer, and as a visionary too, like stopping long enough to bring everyone else along with you, and perhaps more importantly, painting that vision of where it is you're trying to get them to go?
Yeah. The best answer I guess I have is we do it two ways, because I want to be pragmatic. Like I love being a visionary. Like we could just talk the rest of the show about all kinds of, vision and deeper things, but I value actually making it happen, because
Yeah.
wanting to have a great culture is not the same as having a great culture.
Mm.
Or most of us would have a great culture.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're the founder or a C-level, or especially if you're CEO, you need to be that visionary, right? There's somebody who's got to carry that. Right. And depending on if you're doing EOS or looking at other things, there's that integrator, there's different roles. And what I found is it starts with the leadership team. Like, you can easily get disconnected just amongst the leadership team. And if we're not really, really clear on the vision and the why behind the vision, then nobody's got a shot. Because I feel like it's the game of telephone, right? If the leadership team's not there, then the things that they communicate down are not going to be anywhere close. And so we starts there. And then the other thing is, we went years and years ago from, pre-COVID, from in office and the occasional remote to fully remote. And I think that is important, because I think there are aspects of culture that are vastly easier when you're in person.
Yeah.
When there is a water cooler.
Right. You can take for granted the space between.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
and I think a lot of us, I think I did it. There was somebody else invited me to theirs, which I thought was fun / awkward, to their company water cooler thing. And I tried it just out of like a culture experiment thing. Yeah. But it was like they had a culture in their office of like 5 on Friday of having a beer together before you go home or something like that. And to each their own, but like they tried to do that over Zoom. Oh. And what I found is it was just not the same, just was like, you got to go all buy your own beer, you got to come back and you're like, I hope I don't spill it in my office. And, it's just different dynamics.
It's almost like it shifts the intent or the desire from something that you want to do to something that you have to do. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And I think, for all the things that technology does, I find being on whatever platform, Teams and whatever, as I'm an introvert, and I actually find that draining. And so if you want to get together and have yet another one at the end of the day, on the end of the week, it's just like, do we have to do that? Yeah. But being in person, it's not nearly as draining. So I think for me, it was just, we spent so much time trying to learn from other companies and adopt our own, of like, there's a difference between remote culture and in office. And I think hybrid's probably the hardest of both worlds.
Yeah. I want to stick really kind of on that topic of people for a second. One, because I know you've started, ran, operated, led several different companies of your own, but just like in the opener, you're on a mission to interview 100 of the highest, largest, fastest growing, like a lot of leaders essentially. So as we look at people, and if you really think back about all the conversations that you've had so far with those leaders, are there any themes that you've been able to sort of observe, because your lens is so broad over so many of those conversations with people who are finding success, even though the definition of that can be different, as it relates to people? Like, is there anything you've distilled so far about people and building and leading great teams?
Yeah. I mean, there was somebody that asked me, they're like, how do you seem interview after interview so curious? So you keep showing up asking these questions in this way. And I'm like, because I am. And I don't mean that I'm always curious, but like whoever I'm interviewing, like we say no to lots of people. So the folks that I'm interviewing, I'm very fortunate, especially now that I get, like you said, this broader lens. And so I am kind of viewing it from, I was an MSP, I'm currently running a business, and I am trying to figure out, like, how do I attract better people? How do I keep better people? How do I make culture something other than beanbags and ping pong tables? And so I get to, ask all these questions, and from every one of those, I would usually take at least one takeaway and learning. And now the process of writing the book is forcing me to distill that and and distill those down, which is a wonderful gift and a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm definitely starting to see the patterns of like, okay, I see it. I love it when I discover the outlier
Yeah.
around culture where they make it more tangible.
Right.
But I'm starting to see patterns. It's like, if you do this, you probably have a really good culture. If you don't do this, it's probably lacking in those ways. And not all of the people that think they have a good culture are doing all of those things. And I think that points back to what you said. It's like the vision I have of the culture that I have could be very different from what the culture really is.
Right. And the disconnect through the organization of how that gets watered down, distilled, diluted, whatever the right word is, right? I think is often something that was one of the first things I could see start to slip in the larger organizations I was a part of too, was like the almost game of telephone as it relates to things as critical as like, who are we and what do we do and how, like, what are our principles, core values, whatever you want to call them, like, but what is the stamp of DNA that we should all, for the most part, have in common, because we have a shared bond in this identity that we wear and we put on underneath the logo of the company that we choose to show up for. Has there been any defining moment, whether it's a light bulb moment or just like, oh, once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it again, or heard it, you couldn't unhear it again, specifically about finding, maybe it's sourcing, maybe it's just unlocking, maybe it's retaining, but it's still just people, right? Like, what's the most counterintuitive thing you've been surprised by as it relates to people and building a team?
No, that's a huge question. I love it. So for me, the most counterintuitive, it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but it wasn't to me, which is I thought people would think more like I do. And, people have their own reasons, and it doesn't mean that mine is the right one and yours is the wrong one, as much as it means that we have different individual core values. We value certain aspects of what we do highly differently. And those lead to very different interpretations of a challenge. Here's this challenge. Can we go do it? And some people are fired up about it and why.
Right.
And there's just, couldn't imagine doing that. And so for me, the biggest unlock has been that I need to make, I think the thing is, it goes back to when I was hiring earlier on. I thought, well, you know what? The biggest and the best companies, like the Fortune 500, they must have put the most thought into it. So earlier on, I would just go copy a job description from a successful MSP or a Fortune 500 for, whatever it was. Didn't matter if it was, accountant or a L2 or whatever the role was.
Yeah.
And the thing that I missed is it missed our culture entirely, and didn't represent us well. And so, the long answer to your question is, to try to say it more succinctly, is I tried following everybody else's process from the very beginning of thinking about the role and the job ad and job description, all the way to interview process, all the way to understanding people, the formality level of the interview, how we do in the interviews. And it took me way too long to realize if you want to get to know our culture, interview with us, right? That's the way. It's like your client's first experience with you is going to be largely shaped on the first interaction, and the same thing with your team. And what took me too long is there's two funnels for every business. We spend all this time on the client acquisition funnel, and we spend usually very little time on the talent acquisition and the talent retention funnel.
Yeah.
Right. We buy CRMs so that we can retain our clients and upsell our clients, and really fancy marketing systems. And we hire CROs and CMOs. And then it's been my experience that finally, when we get large enough, we go, okay, I'll hire that HR person. And the HR usually is not a strategic. Usually it is, well, you got to have somebody to, do the payroll or make us compliant or some other
Yeah. Deal with benefits questions.
benefit. Like, who wants to deal with that, right? It's a hire that is out of necessity, not out of, strategy. So that I have spent, I feel like every moment since then, trying to understand like people in general. Part of the reason I ask so many questions.
Yeah.
And why they do things. And just as an example, you can be really driven by one goal. And if we're on the same team, and I might not be driven by that goal at all, and it may just be because I don't feel like it's using my talents. It may be because I don't have the same kind of motivation that you do. And we could both be great people, right? But one of us isn't motivated by that particular goal. And the old me would say, well, that's the wrong fit. I've got the wrong person. And so it was just born out of this pain of hiring what I called the wrong person over and over again. Now I did my fair share or unfair share of hiring the wrong people because I didn't have a lot of the intelligence and process to try to sort through that. But the other thing is, I feel like there's a certain point where you get in a business where you fire a client. Maybe some people haven't, but if you've been in business long enough, usually you find a client that you need to fire, and it's not always maybe the thing you want to do, but it's the thing you need to do. But I feel like it's far more painful when you have to let somebody go, especially when, like if they steal, right? If they just do this, like, okay, great. Like this is really easy. You're
make
gone.
it easy for you.
Yeah. If they quit showing up to work, okay. But when you've hired them and they're showing up and they're trying their best and they're working really hard, that's what used to get me. It's like, well, I promised them a spot on this team, and I told them if they do this, they could have a spot on that team, and they're doing it at least to the best of their ability. And so that's kind of that gap. It's like I don't want to be in that spot where I've hired somebody and essentially I've set them up to fail because I didn't understand enough about them to put them in a spot where they're going to win.
Yeah, that's really important. Maybe my second MSP, I think it was. One of the core values that we had was to put ourselves and our customers and employees and peers in a position to win. And I remember like the first time I even saw those words on a piece of paper, it's just like on the one hand, it was a little too out of reach to understand and comprehend. I was also young, but the other side of it was like that sort of like something that just made me say, duh, like that was just a kind of a default thing. But to your earlier point about like not everyone in the world sees the world through your lens. That was a huge awakening at the same MSP, but several years later when I was then responsible for my first team of people. And it wasn't just like, hey, you're responsible for these 2 people, don't screw it up. It's like, here's 26 of them. Good luck, right? And I'm probably 24 at the time. So it's like, not that age has anything to do with it, but like, no formal training. It was just one of those scenarios. It just kind of worked out. You take your best person at this and you slot them over here and you Peter principle it, and that just is what it is. I'm grateful for the experience, but I quickly realized I had 26 people that saw the world 26 different ways. And that's just one-to-one. I did end up getting multiple mentors along the way, which is something I'll dive in with you as well. But one of my mentors, Gus, early on, taught me the, like big management theory of span of control. And the way he said it, I might butcher it today, but this is how I remember it, is as the number of people you are directly responsible for increases algebraically, the number of basically interpersonal relationships that you have to manage increases geometrically. So like I was responsible for 26 people. It wasn't just 26 relationships I had to manage. It was the interdynamics of all the 26 people in that, right? Which compounds out to some other crazy number. And then you add in the fact that they all have a different lens, right? So that was an interesting way to find out the hard way, which is basically my experience for 18 years in the MSP space. But are there any of those kinds of like things you couldn't have predicted, anticipated, expected, but once you encountered it, it sort of changed everything for how you ever looked at how you run a team of people or lead a team of people? Run's not the right word. Lead, manage, serve people. from your experience?
Yeah, I think it was born out of similar, not necessarily thrust into 26 people, but similar frustration of like, I just assumed if we all said we were going to go after this goal and we all said yes, that like a lot of the things would take care of themselves. And especially for the most part, they were not only good people, but they were showing up. I mean, it wasn't that they weren't capable. They had the hard skills
Yeah.
and other things like that. And so I was one reframe that helped me because I came, I think like you, from the technical mindset originally, and before adopting a people mindset, and I was used to troubleshooting, and I had to reframe it and say, I've got not to troubleshoot in terms of fix, but I need to frame this in terms of how do I lead, like a root cause analysis type of troubleshooting. Like, how do I get to the bottom of this? And the best way I know how is actually trying to understand them better, each individual.
Yeah.
And I made I don't know if yours is a mistake, but mine was a mistake. One point we grew really, really quickly. And I had 17 direct reports. And that was way more than I was capable of doing a good job at, especially early. And I don't recommend that number today. And so, and what was worse is I was CEO at the time. So 17 across every department, not like 17 in one department. And so very different needs, goals, schedules, everything. So yeah, for me, it's come down to trying to understand people at a different level. And that's kind of led me on a whole nother journey.
Yeah. And let's stay right on that topic for a second, because I feel like I've had maybe 3 of these conversations just in the last 7 days alone, where the circumstance will come up. And I don't know if it's this way in other industries, because the MSP space and like technical people is the only place I've spent time. So it's something that I've found to be true, even though it's a generalization. I'll put that out there. But traditionally, it seems like if it's characteristics or personality type or the traits, like I don't know what label to give it, but I've seen a lot of this characteristic in MSP where, again, we approach the conversation through this like win-lose dynamic, right? It's right, it's wrong, it's black, it's white, it's win or it's lose. Like there's stakes at the conversation level, right? And to me, it's more prevalent in like the technical mindset makeup people, which again is the majority of us. And I had it as well until I switched to sales and got humbled hard in my first meeting. And learned like everything else that I wanted was on the other side of not caring about being right and wrong. It was about understanding. Right. It was about connection. It was about genuinely being curious in a lot of ways. Right. But I had to figure a lot of that out through the evolution there. So I want to talk through out of that story, like the aha moment, whether you have either had it or you evolved through that same process, but like that transition between looking at a conversation with a customer, with a prospect, with an employee about being right or being wrong, but winning or losing, like the authority component versus like genuinely leaning in to understand. And like, one, have you gone through that evolution? And 2, like, what was it for you that turned that light bulb on? And maybe 3, do you have this kind of like secret mnemonic device that you use to like trigger that persona that needs to show up that way?
Yeah. I guess I have a little similar journey, in which is, I went from being technical to sales, and man, get my butt kicked all the time, right? And there's I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but there's owner-led sales where you're getting a ton of referrals and you're closing a few deals, and that's still sales. And then there is building an SDR team from scratch and picking up the phone with them and smiling and dialing and make 100 dials a day and building a team to do that. And I don't care who you are, like, it's just not a fun thing to do. You can make the job a fun thing, but like getting hung up on 98 out of 100 times is just not a joyful experience. And so I did it, and I did it myself to prove that out. And so, that taught me a lot about myself. It taught me a lot about people.
Yeah.
And then I still had to learn that lesson again because I wanted to put my technical hat on when it came to my team, because it was easier to say, well, those are just people that don't really know us. They haven't heard our story, our culture, our mission. You know what I mean? They just took 30 seconds and then hung up on us. They didn't really, buy in. The team is different, right? They're, especially what you said, like, I think as a technical person, it's easy to look for a binary outcome. And I want it to I want to figure out who's right and then do the right thing, or I'm right and they need to do the right thing, even worse. And to get past that and understand that we're all different. And the thing is nobody needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And it took me entirely too long to realize that's the core of it.
Yeah.
And it's not the same, but took me too many years of marriage to realize that it's not my job to fix her. I need to show up in a certain way. And the goal is to do things together and stay together, not to win, not to be right. And I feel like, I try to approach it in a similar way. It's to try to understand what you're going through, your point of view, your perspective, your lens. And for me, that's led to building an entire elaborate process, discovery of a whole set of people that I didn't know of, and language to talk about it, and even founding a new company.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, this endeavor of, I personally, I would associate like sales is a great personal development career, right? Like it's such a black and white direct feedback loop. And so you really only have a couple of options, but most of that leads to self-development and improvement, right? And then that turns more into the communication, the psychology, the understanding of people, since that's the business that it's in. And I really want to go back to a point that I shouldn't have glossed over. So we'll just go straight back to it. But when you said that there's really two funnels in every business, a lot of, even the MSP shows, but a lot of shows talk about like sales funnel, sales process. And I get it, but we'll just park that conversation somewhere else, because I really want to lean back into the people funnel that you talk about and that we've talked about. And without getting away any of your trade secrets necessarily, but like I really just want to sit down and like demystify what that might look like for Damien and what that might look like for a business that wants to adopt that level of thinking. And I'll add my examples too, because I've got some things to add that we've learned here at SIFT as well. So as you think about your people funnel, first of all, maybe just explain it, and then I'll dive in with subsequent changes or questions from there.
Yeah, it's a pretty unorthodox approach that finally took over a decade to settle in on, and even longer to figure out why I was even doing it this way. And I finally, after over a decade of doing it this way, realized that I am what I would call unconventional. And I mean that not only in maybe the way I approach things, but unconventional in terms of a certain level of a part of the approach, and part of it being kind of some level of neurodivergence. So think, ADD or ADHD or on the spectrum, or just there's different levels of neurodivergence. And like a lot of things, it's not good nor bad. It just creates and shapes you in certain ways. And what I did was spent over a decade building this process that didn't disqualify what I now refer to as unconventional hires and unconventional people. And pretty much every other process, starting all the way from the job ad, already does. And so as a real practical example, most job ads say you need a 4-year degree and you need 5 years experience and you need this and this and this. And even entry level, you need a 4-year degree in computer science or whatever it is. And those are the only people I can hire. And what I looked at it and said, what if we put more effort into the process? Because if I go all the way back to kind of first principles thinking, I have a couple beliefs that people may not agree on. One is the people are what make the difference. Mm. And I think especially if you're building an MSP, it's a business built on people. And so those are the differentiator. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it's easier to hire than others, but I just assume by default, there's always going to be a shortage of amazing people. Maybe there won't be a shortage of good people or even great people, but there will be a shortage of amazing people. So number one, it's all about the people. Number two, there will always be a talent war for the people that I want on my team. Yeah. And so the first thing that we did is we said, how do we take off the normal filters? Maybe a little less experience. For us, the typical degree and those sort of things. And then, of course, as soon as we did that, we created a different problem, which is I went from like, I put out this stuff and I advertise and I get like 3.5 applicants and they're all bad, but they fit the criteria, to now I get 300.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the beginning of that for me. And then what we ended up doing is learning how to find essentially what I would call a diamond in the rough and building a system and a process to measure what I will basically refer to as your trajectory. Yeah. And so what it took me too long to realize is if there's two people and they both, have a certain skill set in virtualization or cloud or whatever the thing is, and they both kind of sound like they can talk similar levels of tech or this or that. But if I use a few different tools and if I use a few different pieces of the process, I could learn that you're growing on a much faster trajectory. And in 2 or 3 years, you're going to be 10x where you are now. And there's somebody else that has a similar skill set. Maybe their skill set's actually a little better than yours today, but they're growing at 10% a year in their walk. Yeah. And that's okay. And I think you have to be careful because if you have people growing too fast, that may not fit your culture. Sure. So you've got to know that. But for us, it started with opening up the gates, and I didn't even know that I was looking for unconventional people or that I was designing a process until later. But it opens it up, and that, I guess there's two things I'll say about that. Most business owners tend to be unconventional, not all. Mm-hmm. Of the general population, the statistics I found is about 20% of people are. So out of normal hiring, this broadens it a number 20%, which is a pretty big difference. I mean, what if you could improve your margin 20%, right? Who wouldn't? Right. So if you can improve your talent pipeline 20%, why wouldn't you? Yeah. And then lastly, when we're making a lot of these hires, whether leadership or technical, unless we've already built out a mega corporation, not every hire should be what I call unconventional, but some of those hires tend to be highly unconventional because they figure things out in ways that you could never imagine. And that led to the next discovery and the next discovery that they can present unique ways that you need to manage and lead.
Yeah. Right. This is going to be probably an inaccurate overrepresentation and oversimplification, but it reminded me of one of Steve Jobs' early recorded conversations about basically like what the world would call the A players, right? But it was different in his world. And it was this combination of there's thinkers and there's doers, but then there's the small subset that is the thinkers and the doers. And those are the ones also that are pushing boundaries. They're finding the edges. They're extrapolating technology from other areas into like making their world better and better, more effective, more efficient, more this, more that. And so it's certainly outsider edge, fringe edge, kind of like is the way it seems to manifest. In our experience, what we've found and seen and sort of adapted over that time was a a concept that I had sort of learned from making bad hires myself, or not bad hires, like I failed as the hiring person, right? It wasn't the bad person, but I didn't realize there was a book written on it until I read it last year, which was Who and Not How, right? I'd read some other books like from Jeff Smart and those kinds of things that really helped more in like on top grading and that kind of stuff. Like that kind of helped a little bit, but the Who Not How is such a fundamentally simple way of thinking about going towards the objective that as we look at a people funnel, we've actually almost to the extent adopted this like we don't hire people, we recruit people mentality or concept, because like we know the problem that we want to solve. We have a vision of what success criteria looks like, but the thinker and the doer that's out there is going to be able to do the how part like so much better than we could even conceive anyway, right? And so a couple of sales guys running a company look at people through that same like funnel and process, right? Like we go and recruit, we don't hire.
Yeah.
And there's
same kind of funnel
there. Yeah, there's an element there that's like, generally speaking, not all the time, but generally speaking, those impact makers are also not searching the job boards for the next thing, right? Like they're sought out and recruited, or they know someone who knows someone that gets them the conversation. And so I'd be interested to know maybe the actual like people part of your process a little bit more. Does that recruit not hire, maybe not my language, but the intent, does that also match an element of the system that you've built and designed?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. There's another friend of mine that's built an amazing tech company, and we're both into culture, and we were talking one day over lunch, and I thought we were aligned around, recruit not hire type of wording. And my point is they had a good team and good culture and they're growing fast, but where our opinions diverge is, be really clear what you want, go after that. Okay, great. Where ours diverged was, as soon as you find somebody that fits that, you hire them. That was their process. And our process is that we're looking for the best available person at that time, not the first available person at that time.
Yeah.
And of course, when I say it that way, it can make it sound like they're just hiring the first warm body. They meant that fit their criteria, have the technical skills, that sort of thing. But it's a very different, everything, as a friend I knew well, so we went through each other's hiring process, and everything was incredibly different. The pro is they tended to hire faster. Ours was we tended to keep people, though, and not have that churn because our hiring process was more thorough, slower, but far more thorough. So at the end of the day, it's not the same, but it's a little bit like when you're just selling stuff to anybody that can fog a mirror. You have no idea of your ideal client profile, and you have no niche. I mean, you're just going to sell to anybody, and it feels cool when you win a deal, but like you don't have much of a differentiator. They don't really know why they're doing business with you. You don't really know why you're doing business with them. And I feel like a very similar mentality. If you don't let your culture show them why you're hiring and what you're doing, then somebody may join you that's just looking to join something.
Yeah. One other thing that reminded me of, that was a hard lesson learned too, sort of maybe when I realized later on that I would be an effective salesperson, was actually born and bred out of being a hiring manager. And I made the mistake of selling people on the need that I had and the role that was open, more than truly qualifying them into being the best and the right fit for it, right? Because to the point earlier, I'm a troubleshooter. I'm a problem solver by nature. I'm intrinsically that way, but I can communicate fairly effectively with people, and I'm also a bit visionary. So like, I can really build that vision and get it compelling, until I realized I was doing it all wrong. Like it wasn't so much at that stage of a hiring process where it was like, let me sell you on how amazing this is going to be, without realizing I was doing it, until you get through again a couple of people where it's like, man, what did I miss? Why did this not work? what's going on? Like, why is this my fault? I have to fix something about me, about how this process is working, about all those things. And, later on, I can look back and see that it was more about the urgency and the impact and the need that I had. And from MSP standpoint, I feel like everyone's in that same boat. We never really evolved too far beyond buying bodies for bandwidth.
Yeah.
And I hate saying it that way, but it's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Right. And what we're talking about is like way down the iceberg of evolution of that.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, can you distill the three most critical components? Like if they're in the bodies by bandwidth reality today, and they think Damien's process is cool, I have no idea where to begin. Like, what are the three most important elements to get right, regardless of the rest of it, to start putting something together today?
Well, the biggest one I would share is the reframe it took. I had to go because we've all been there. We're growing too fast. We're all working around the clock. I'm afraid my team's going to quit because we're working so many hours. I just, my standards were here. And then with each passing week, they lower because it's like the team and we're just working, we're burning midnight oil. And so I think it's human nature to go, maybe you don't say it out loud, but like the standards end up lowering as time goes on. And so I needed to protect myself against that because, all things being equal, I'll probably do the easier. And that means I'm going to maybe say yes to somebody that's, if I weren't, like, I just landed a new client, I need to, hire now. But if somebody else churned and I had a little, and I had enough capacity for another month or two, would I have hired them? No, I wouldn't have.
Right.
So the reframe is, I'm not hiring. I'm not just adding a body, because my thing was, once they say yes, or once their start date has, I've done it, because I've gone through this whole process of writing a job description and running the ads or using recruiters and however many steps your interview processes are, and technical interviews and culture interviews. I've tried to do the right things. I got all this time, right? We've got this whole sunk cost fallacy coming up now that we've done all of that. And then I used to think, man, once they start, I'm good. So the reframe for me is, it's time to performance. And what I mean by that is, I may need to take longer to hire the right person, so the right person can get up to speed. Because what I really am, the job to be done is, I need somebody to help the team with the workload to whatever I'm hiring them into, and to be capable of doing that. The job is not showing up day one. And if I don't hire the right person, and let's be clear, there's the obvious ones where they just turn out, or they get fired because, we thought they were brilliant and it turns out they can't, they don't know how to open a computer or something. There's really bad fit, but it's the other ones that are the worst. They're the ones that are like, I've been walking around with this little pebble in my shoe for long enough that I've kind of forgotten that it's there. And it's like, the question is, would you enthusiastically, if you sold your MSP and then a year from now you decide you're going to start another and you had no non-compete, would you enthusiastically rehire every single person on that team? Yeah. And if you pause for a minute on any of those as you're listing them, there's an issue. And that's where I found myself. So the reframe for me is, how do I get the right person and up to performance, not just get the right person?
Yeah. I love that time to performance frame. It's a different way, actually, of describing something I experienced again the hard way by doing it wrong too many times, which was, I fell into that bucket you described. I felt like I solved the problem as soon as the offer letter was accepted. I didn't solve the problem 90 days in, and they've met the success criteria of the reason I opened the role to begin with. Right. And like, I had a fully built out plan, and like their entire first 3 weeks was scheduled on the books before they got there, and all the equipment was there. Like, that was not the level of preparation I was putting into setting someone up to win, to succeed, right? Going way back to that second MSP, like putting them in a position to be successful. And that's on me. It's the hard work. It's the stuff that takes time and focus, and like sitting down with a pen and paper first, right? And that was a challenge. And but I learned it, slowly, like an old dog, over time, basically going through that same process. But
That's how the hardest lessons I feel like are, right? You're just
yeah,
like, why? And unless you just grew up a people manager or came out of a role, I think it's going to hit you,
yeah,
because if you're fortunate enough to need people and
hmm
grow quickly, you're going to need them faster. You're going to feel this pressure to
yeah,
hire
yeah,
quickly.
yeah,
And then, the thing is, maybe if you, for a while, I started to think, what analogy can we learn from as MSPs? Like there's the big accounting firms, like the really mega ones, the
hmm
mega law firms. Like, can we learn from them? How do they scale so big, and do those sort of things? And my point is, they're skilled workers. They bill out at higher rates than most of us do,
yeah,
at least the attorneys, right? So, but then you start to look at the analogy and you're like, well, if you have 1,000 attorneys, you don't need 250 of them on one project to be able to. And if you do, you're just selling hours
hmm
versus, you need a whole stack of complex things. You have this
right,
person that only knows this layer of the stack, and you need all these different things. So it's a very different business.
hmm
And aside from the fact that you probably didn't go to school to be a accountant or
yeah,
attorney,
uh,
I'm hiring a very different kind of personality.
yeah,
And usually they have to be more willing to learn and adopt new things
hmm
because of that, right?
yeah,
This is generally, as an MSP, there's not too many come in, stay here for 30 years,
mm,
not picking on accounting or attorneys, but you can kind of do the same thing,
yeah,
get your CE credits. And as one of those fields, kind of do a pretty similar thing for your whole, life. And most of the technology we work on today didn't exist a decade ago,
hmm
right? So
yeah,
you're going to have a whole different level of pace of change. And back to the other, neither's bad, neither's wrong. It just
hmm
means that it took me too long to realize that people that maybe don't want that level of change,
hmm
they're not going to make it.
yeah. Like
Um,
you have to face the facts of reality
yeah.
and understand that reality might also unfold one day at a time. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's really uncomfortable, especially if reality is conflicting with your desire or your vision.
Mm-hmm.
But you have options, you have choice, right? Like you can step back into the control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that point. All right. Last question I have for you, which is the loaded question
Okay.
to actually get a question out of you for the next guest in the show. And so if you could kind of put your time machine hat back on and send one question back in time to the Damien 10 years ago, what would you ask yourself?
Um, One that I miss far too often is, the way I'll frame it is, what is truly the top constraint, right? And what I mean by that is, man, it's so much easier just to adopt a new shiny widget in the tech stack and throw it in, or, evaluate this or that and change it out. And I didn't really do anything. I mean, I got a little nicer dashboard, but like I didn't
Mhm.
make a big difference. Than it is to go,
Yeah.
man, the thing that's holding the business back is I'm unwilling to step out of my comfort zone and up my game in unload sales.
Yeah.
Or I'm unwilling to admit that I have no ability to differentiate when it comes to talent.
Mm.
Because let's face it, usually we struggle to differentiate in sales. And if
Mhm.
you make it past that chasm, the number of folks that take the time to try to differentiate from a culture and a talent
Yeah.
attracting perspective is far fewer. And
Mhm.
so, any of those things, wherever you're fighting, it's like, where's my top constraint?
Mm.
Where's the number one constraint? And therefore, where should I really spend my time? And one, I didn't really know how to frame the question. And two, I think I was too scared
Mm.
because it was going to put me way outside my comfort zone.
Yeah.
Because often it wasn't, my top constraint is evaluating, vendors
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
as the tech, originally the tech
Mhm.
person, like, oh, the top constraint is like, I like these juicy
Mhm.
technical problems. Like, okay, maybe
Yeah.
you enjoy that, but that's not the constraint to to what the business needs.
Yeah. Ironically enough, it's like in order to face that question, you have to face reality as it is and not as you want it to be, right?
Exactly.
And there's so much discomfort in that because it's accountability, it's transparency, it's oftentimes growth, it's everything else. Like the separation is in that pain, even if the pain is just perceived, right? Just like
And I think a decade ago, I'm not sure. Nobody ever asked that to me that way, but I'm not sure I would have had the vulnerability to show up and be honest about it. I think in most settings, if somebody said, "What's your top constraint?" I'd be like, "I need more leads. If leads just fell out of the sky, it'd be great, you know." And maybe if you think through it, maybe it is the top constraint, but maybe you can't keep up with the hiring. Maybe there's no differentiation, right? There's something deeper than just I need more. Because sometimes the first answer is like saying I need more cash.
Yeah.
Or, you know, if I had more cash in the bank, everything would be wonderful, right? Well, you know, is that really the thing holding you back?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's an interesting under layer to that without opening up a whole nother can of worms. But you mentioned it, and I'll just call it out for that, as that's first principles thinking. Right. And if that's the first time you've heard of it as a listener too, like I encourage you, go out, do a little bit of light reading on the topic, find the questions that really challenge you to dig a little bit deeper and start stripping back the layers of what you think until you can get down to first principles, because the world sort of opens up when you get that level of clarity, at least in my experience.
Yeah. And I love this discussion and love to go deeper. I mentioned that I'm the host of MSP Mindset, so I get to see this broad view. Scarcity, you know, is where we help MSPs with making sure that they don't ever have to worry about their backup and disaster recovery and take that load away from them. And that's been the lab that I've gotten to build this out in the real world, like the lab, but also the real world. And then I went and sought the best people in the world and drank my own Kool-Aid, took my own advice, and formed a company called everyonehateshiring.com. And so we help you understand yourself first, and then others at a level that you've probably never been able to do. And then everything, once you understand people, becomes possible, because what you said, it goes back to who, not how.
Yeah, absolutely. Out of all of those locations, if somebody wants some more of Damian Stevens, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an individual no matter what I'm working on. So maybe find me on LinkedIn, drop me a note, say hello. You can always shoot me an email, dstevens@servacity.com. Give me a call, shoot me a text, whatever. Love to engage, see how I could be of help in any way. If you can't tell, I'm curious, so maybe I'll at least ask a question or two that could be helpful. And love to connect with you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, Damien. Hopefully, if nothing else, the audience comes away with just the awareness of how deep and wide your experience is, both professionally and also as a person, like you said. So I encourage anyone out there, if you want to tap in more, reach out to him. And thank you again. Appreciate you being here.
It's been fun being on the other side of the mic. Yeah, appreciate it, Jeffrey.